matter what, we come together for the good of our constituents, and I'm proud and honored to lead the People's House of the New York State Legislature.
The health and protection of the human beings that live in our districts is our responsibility.
Frederick Douglass's words for us today, I quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress."
If you want equity to happen, then this is where it happens.
All of us have a responsibility to the greater good.
The House will come to order.
Hello, welcome to Assembly Update. I'm Liz Koenig. Today we're going to be talking about the brand new legislative session with our guest, Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz, who represents the 81st Assembly District in the Bronx. Thank you very much for coming in.
It's wonderful to be back.
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, always good to be back in Albany. So starting the new session, what are some of your priorities coming up this session?
Well, we want to convince the governor when she submits her executive budget in a couple of weeks to include some issues that we very much care about, including the Climate Change Superfund Act. We know that's a heavy lift in terms of convincing enough people, but this is such a crucial piece of legislation. If we are serious about addressing the issue of climate change, then we got to take serious action. And the Climate Change Superfund Act would provide $3 billion a year, not coming from the taxpayers, but rather coming from the fossil fuel companies that caused the problem in the first place. They made the mess, they got to clean it up, or at least help clean it up. Right now, they're not only not helping to clean it up, they're making things worse. So we want to deal with that. And I hope the governor, thinks big, thinks, boldly and innovatively, and supports this concept and includes it in her executive budget.
Now, a piece of legislation that you're working on deals with election law and insurrection. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. As we learned throughout last year, because most people really never focused on this, there is a provision in the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, Section 3, which essentially says insurrectionists can't be running for office. Now, personally, I would like to see Donald Trump on the ballot in New York. I really would, because I want to see us beat him. And we can't beat him if he's not on the ballot. So it would, the pleasure of seeing him go down in flames in New York, we just wouldn't enjoy that pleasure if he weren't on the ballot. However, I'm a very strong believer in the Constitution. And the Constitution, at least my reading of it, is very clear. Section 3 prohibits, and I'm looking at the bill memo, prohibits former federal office holders who, having previously taken an oath of office to support the Constitution of the United States, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States. He engaged in insurrection. Now, one could argue there are people out there who were totally the victims of delusion, who said, oh, that was just a peaceful demonstration on January 6, 2021. But I think most rational, reasonable, sane people know that that's just not the case. And he led the way on that. And that was the first time in the history of this country that there was, in essence, an attempted coup to take over, to overturn an election. That's what that was all about. So that's exactly what I think this section of the 14th Amendment pertains to. And I think that we got to recognize that. Now, the bill that I put in doesn't mention anything about Trump. It applies to anybody who's done things like that, but apparently he's the only one. And it would provide that the Board of Elections can block such a person from being on the ballot. And if the Board of Elections stalemates in its decision, which it probably would, because the Board of Elections is comprised of 4 people, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and it's fairly predictable how they would vote on such a thing, then the decision will be made by the Attorney General of the state of New York, the person elected by millions of people to enforce the law, among other things. So it's a very simple bill. The bill it's all on one page, and I think fair is fair. If we don't address things like this, it's just an invitation for it to happen again. And there are polls that have come out where a significant percentage of the people in his political party actually believe that January 6, 2021 was not what we all know it was, and that's fairly dangerous. We've never really had a situation in our country where you've had, I'll call him like a cult leader, as opposed to having two political parties. We used to have two political parties, one with that I'm part of and one that I disagree with, but there were real policy differences. I mean, you had people in the other party, whether we liked them or not. Ronald Reagan, and I definitely didn't like him, but Ronald Reagan and John McCain and Mitt Romney and others who focused on issues. But now the Republican Party is not focused on issues. It's focused on supporting the leader of their cult. So anyway, this legislation, which does not mention Trump, but I think pertains to him. Now, will this be passed? Will it survive any court challenges? The issue itself is probably going to the Supreme Court soon, because in Colorado, they invalidated his ability to be on the ballot for this very reason. They've also done that in Maine. The Maine decision was made by the Secretary of State. In Colorado, it was made by the courts there. So it'll undoubtedly be decided by the Supreme Court. And do I have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court these days? Not really, but who knows?
Now, what would you say to folks who might say that because he hasn't been convicted of insurrection, I mean, is this kind of a subjective thing to, so maybe you or I might think, yes, he is an insurrectionist, but somebody else might say, well, no, he didn't cause this. What would the argument be with that?
Well, then they can go to court. And should this be enacted and should he not be allowed on the ballot, they can go to court. So it's not like there's no recourse here. And I agree with you. People will make various arguments, but there are various things that prevent somebody from running for president. If you're below the age of 35, you cannot run for president. You don't have to be convicted of being age 34. Either you are or you aren't. If where you were born actually makes a difference, and there were other criteria, and this would be one of those.
Okay. Now, other legislative priorities. What else are you working on?
Well, the governor, unfortunately, vetoed a very important housing bill of mine. I don't understand for the life of me why she would veto it. It was a very anti-tenant thing to do, but I'll give you the backstory. In 2009, before 2019, when we passed the HSTPA, which was the huge tenant reform bill, we actually had a number of people come to my office and complain that their landlords were gouging them. When they moved in, the landlord said, this is the rent, because the previous rent was such and such. But at a later date, they found out that the previous rent was much lower, and therefore they couldn't charge them the rent they were charging them. But under the law and various rulings, the tenant could only look back, I think it was 4 years at the time. So if a landlord deliberately, in a very defrauding the person, defrauded the tenants or future tenants by falsifying records, for example, but it was 5 years ago, there was nothing they could do about it. Now, is that fair? Should a landlord be able to profit from his or her own fraud, or even just a mistake for that matter? So we put a provision in that omnibus bill that was essentially a bill that I had put in, but the omnibus bill that we passed was like a dozen bills, including some of my own. And that pro-tenant and fair provision, because it was only aimed at landlords who commit fraud, and most landlords, I don't believe, are committing fraud. Part of that was overruled by the court in a lawsuit based on what the court said was that you're applying it like retroactively. So we passed a bill last year which would essentially apply this concept prospectively, so that from now on, you know, if a landlord did that, you can then look back, and what a great idea. But the governor, unfortunately, vetoed that bill, which was, there was a lot of pressure from landlord groups, basically. So I'm not sure, I know what the veto message said, but I'm not sure what the real reason was, and I'm disappointed in her for doing that, because I think on many, many things she's done great, but not on this. So I'm going to work on this still, because if there's one thing about me is I never give up.
No, you don't. And also with this legislation, is there something that could be amended that would make the governor, you know, more likely to sign it into law?
Well, apparently if we gut the bill, she might sign it into law, but what would be the point?
Yeah. So housing is going to be a big topic coming up this session.
Housing is a big topic. You know, there's allegedly, and I say allegedly not because I don't believe it, but there's allegedly a huge housing shortage. I personally think there is a housing shortage, but I'm not sure it's quite to the degree that the real estate interests are claiming. And I say that partially because there are tens of thousands of apartments being kept empty, warehoused by landlords. They're saying, well, we can't afford to fix it and blah, blah, blah. If we have all these empty units, then maybe there is a housing shortage, but maybe it's not quite what they say it is. But I think all this is being done to ramp up pressure on us to basically to allow anybody to build anywhere, anytime they want, as big as they want. And no, I don't support that. I mean, Mayor Adams has a plan, for example, he calls it the City of Yes, and it's hundreds, maybe thousands of pages. And what it would essentially do is pretty much allow building to take place almost anywhere. And while I don't want to say quite yet what my position on that would be, because I want to make sure I understand all the ins and outs of that plan, it sounds like something that was written by big real estate so they can build, and it sounds like they would create, I don't know, the city of mess if they did that. And so we have to really carefully look at proposals, because yes, do we need more housing? Yes, particularly affordable housing, but that doesn't mean we should just sign on to any plan that's put forth that just allows unlimited development everywhere.
Yes. I know that you're very protective of your district, especially because there is a lot of green space, and I know that we don't want to affect the quality of life.
Green good, concrete bad. That's how,
right.
As a general rule, that's how I look at it.
Okay, great. Well, next time you come in, we could talk about state of the state and more about the budget. So thank you very much for showing.
Okay, thank you.
Talking to us today. We've been speaking with Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz, who represents the 81st Assembly District in the Bronx. Thank you so much for joining us today on Assembly Update. We'll see you next time.